In my first church in 2008, it was an election in 2008. Who's running in 2008? Do you guys? I'm trying to remember who it was. Obama and McCain. Obama and John McCain. And you guys, things were heated that year. Which, boy, if we could go back to heated of 2008, right? And I will never forget. It was around this time, and we had watched some, debates were beginning to happen, et cetera, and I was at church, and a gentleman who was part of our church, Stefan, was just getting really heated one night about Obama. He did not like Obama, and he was really angry about a debate that had happened, et cetera, and there was a moment where I said, Stefan, I've once heard, and I believe it was Jesus who said to love your enemies and to pray for those who persecute you. And if someone hits you on the right cheek, to turn the left to them. And if someone takes your tunic, give them your cloak. If someone forces you to walk 1 mile, walk the second one as well. And it was funny because he stopped for a moment and then he laughed. He laughed at me. And he said, yeah, I know that's what Jesus said, and I'll never forget this as long as I live. Because then he said, but this is the real world. But this is the real world. If there's one story that I could tell you tonight that sums up the full content of what we're going to talk about and the problem with what has become of the religious witness of the church in the day and age in which we are living, it is that sort of thing. And what Russell really highlights in this chapter is this, that we have arrived at the point at which for many people who name the name of Jesus Christ, Christ-likeness is considered to be a compromise. Yes, but this is the real world. We tried that, but it doesn't work. Right? There's stories, multiple stories that Russell tells throughout this chapter. And I can tell you, if anyone would read that and go, that's not true, I experienced it. I have heard people say, yes, but this is the real world. And what I want us to be mindful of as we go throughout our time together tonight is that the realest thing that we could possibly do and the most effective way for us to live, not only as witnesses and proponents of the gospel, but the most effective and most beautiful way for us to live as human beings is to never forget that this is, in fact, the way of Jesus, the way, the truth, and the life. For the moment in which we find ourselves. And however tempted we are to compromise our morality, however tempted we are to compromise our faith for the gain of political power, for the gain of cultural influence, do not forget that ultimately, more than just a mistake, is a forsaking of our Christian identity. And that is really important for us to understand as we go throughout the course of these next few minutes. And so we've arrived at the point at which for many people, the name of Jesus, for many people who claim the name of Jesus, Christ-likeness, forgiveness, mercy, generosity, love of enemy, it's seen as a compromise. And that's a really devastating thing. One of the things that Russell does in his chapter, and I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but it really sets the framework for how we get to where we are. And as I talk to some friends tonight, when we read these chapters, it steps on our toes. It steps on my toes, for sure. And it ought to do that sort of thing. And so this chapter was one in particular where I found myself thinking, oh my. Because he talks about the dissonance, the way that we have shifted culturally over the course of the last few decades to where Christ-likeness was at the center of what we hoped for our political appointees and those who we elect to public office, to now where we are not in that space anymore. And remember that Russell is writing through the evangelical framework. So he's talking about the way evangelicals have shifted in particular. But I want to remind you, this is not specific to one particular party, but it is endemic of the entire political spectrum that we find ourselves in America. And Russell talks about, in particular, the moral majority. I was coming of age in the 1990s. In 96, that era, I was 92 to 90. I was 14, 15 years old. And I remember when Bill Clinton was being impeached. You guys remember that? And Bill Clinton was being impeached because of something that was a terrible moral failure on his part. And there was a moment, not a moment, but there was an extended conversation about how the moral fabric of our leaders matters. How the private, I can't sit for too long, you guys. You know that's not how I do things. That the private lives of our leaders is a reflection of who we are as a country. And that was stated unequivocally from leaders across the spectrum on the moral majority and the religious right. And so Russell lays that out as something that took place. And then he goes, but what has happened to get us to the place where we now find ourselves wholesale ourselves, because it is the evangelical world, almost entirely saying that the moral lives of our elected leaders don't matter anymore. That it shouldn't matter that our leaders stand up and they speak at rallies. And my dad could cuss like an art form. And yet we hear leaders using language that would make him recoil. And we hear rhetoric that dehumanizes. And we hear conversation that isn't fit for my children to hear. I'd cut the television off. And yet we've come to find it as acceptable. Not only acceptable, but we applaud it. Thrice divorced, 4 times divorced, openly admitting that they are, I can go on down the list. And we're not going to do that because it isn't about one person, but it's endemic to the entire spectrum. We've arrived at the place where moral character used to matter, and now we find ourselves where we turn a blind eye. And that, my friends, ultimately is what I want to talk about tonight. And regardless of where you find yourself on the political spectrum, this is a problem not only for the evangelical church, but I really think what Russell is trying to get to in this chapter is that if we are not careful, and I want you to hear me say this, ultimately it is a problem for the sake of your own soul. And the language that we use and the language that we hear, and I've heard it, and sometimes justifiably so, right, is that we find ourselves in a situation where we are saying, and if I've heard it once, I've heard it 1,000 times, I'm choosing between the lesser of 2 evils. How many of y'all watched the debate last night? God bless you. God bless you if you did. I did not. I actually was going to, and I asked my wife, who is much wiser and much more faithful to Jesus than I am at times. I said, babe, do you want to watch the debate? And she said, is this a joke? She said, no. So we didn't. But if you did, I imagine you probably walked out of that feeling like my mind hasn't been changed. Probably don't love either of these 2 people. And what you might be thinking is, I'm choosing the lesser of 2 evils. If I can be honest with you, I've said that many times over the course of my own life over the past decade when we talk about political elections, etc. And there was a moment, maybe my favorite line in the whole of this chapter from Hannah Arendt, who's a philosopher, was a philosopher. And here's what we have to be reminded of, that when we say we're choosing the lesser of 2 evils, those who make that claim, those who claim the lesser evil, we quickly forget, don't we, that we've still chosen evil. And we've still chosen evil. And in the book, and we have to talk about the book because this is part of the framework, is Russell, and remember, Russell, as the head of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention, would have been in proximity not only to presidents, but to great leaders throughout the whole of religious life in America. And he tells a story of meeting with a megachurch pastor who in private said to him prior to the election in 2016 that a particular candidate was an immoral, and he even used language of an evil person. However, we're choosing the lesser of two evils. And what happened over the course of months was that this particular pastor, going on television on a regular basis as a mega church pastor and a national figure, not only never said that sort of thing publicly, but the language shifted so much that he even began to describe this person as a baby Christian, as someone whose actions they even applauded. And you guys, oftentimes when we choose the lesser of two evils, we forget that ultimately we are still choosing evil. And the moral equivocation that we are seeing in the evangelical world right now and in so many of our own selves ought to be something that is deeply concerning to us. Because ultimately, you guys, please hear me out. I am not singling out one political candidate or another, one political party or another, because my ultimate concern is that I stand up on Sunday morning and I tell people, hundreds and hundreds of people and children and teenagers, and I'm telling them that your sexual ethic matters. And the way you speak to other people matters. And your love for your enemy ultimately helps define you as a Christian. And then they cut on their televisions, or they don't actually probably watch television, but they get on their phones and they see religious leaders who are saying the very opposite. And let me tell you what happens, and this should break your heart because it does mine. At some point, these kids hear what I'm saying and hear what many of you are saying, and yet they also hear the rhetoric on television. And if we're honest, sometimes they hear the rhetoric from us, and they say, somebody's lying. And I'm not going to believe any of this anymore. Ultimately, you guys, this whole conversation, losing our integrity, it isn't about a political victory, but it's about the furtherance of the gospel. And I believe that morality and a recovery of morality can save us from what is a glaring and gleaming hypocrisy in the current age in which we live. So Russell says that where we find ourselves now is that for many people, morality has become dependent on outcome. So what is good, what is bad, what is righteous, what is evil is now almost entirely determined by your tribal allegiance. And so, I'll use I don't think my sister is going to watch the YouTube channel on this, right? My sister is a progressive person, but my sister also believes in the sanctity of life. But what I've watched over the course of a decade or so, as she gets sucked into the vacuum of political dredge, what has changed in her? What has changed in her? The way she feels about the sanctity of life. Because morality has become dependent on outcome. And if my team's going to win, then I need to support these platforms. And so her own thought process about what is moral and right has shifted. You know people like this, don't you? And if we're honest, maybe we are people like this, not on that issue, but on other issues. It's just locker room talk. It doesn't really matter, does it? What if I suggested to you that it actually does? Because morality is actually much larger than winning or losing an election. Morality is larger than the success or failure of your church. My grandfather, who was a great man, he was a prisoner of war in World War II. He came out And he's 6'4", weighed 240 pounds. But when he got out, he weighed 135 pounds. And he was an alcoholic for a number of years. And then one day he woke up, this is a miracle, and he said, I don't want to drink anymore. Just quit. And he was a great grandfather to me. And one of the things that I'll never forget him telling me is he said, and I don't even know where he heard this, and I'm not even sure it makes sense, but he said, Will, and he's just country as the day is long. He said, the truth will stand when the world is on fire. The truth will stand when the world's on fire. Our morality, what is true for us as human beings, and more importantly, as followers of Jesus, should not be dependent on the outcome of a win or a loss or success or failure. Because if Jesus said it's true, guess what? It's true. That is really, really important for us. Again, I just want to remind you of the shifting nature of what we think is good and bad in political life right now. Not what I was trying to do. Hold on. I think that's the second week in a row I've dropped that thing, so maybe I should just throw it away. Screen monitoring. Did it go back? LW. Sorry. And, what code is that? What doesn't give me a code? We're good. Cancel and play. Good. Okay. Oh, goodness gracious. You see that battery anywhere, Dolores? There it is. Hey, David, can you edit this out of the YouTube feed before we post it online? It'd be nice if you could. The eclipse of character through power. This is interesting because we're talking about politics in the first half of this. But then Russell shifts, and I think this is really fascinating because what Russell says is that multiple issues. How did we get to this point in life? And he says, actually, the church has been doing this long before we ever got involved in the political game. Because we have used equivocation on our moral framework to prop up and hold up ministers who are successful, who are leading people to Jesus, or whatever the language we want to use is. And he says the eclipse of character through power has happened in many evangelical circles before it was ever applied to politics. Kenneth Copeland gets on television and says, God wants me to fly around in a private jet. That's insane. And yet people take it as normative. Jim and Tammy Faye Baker, right? We laugh about it, but back in the day, that was a real thing. And the list goes on and on and on, and I could call out 1 million pastors right now in this current moment. But we don't need to do that, do we? Because I think we all can speak to the reality that this is true for so many, and the church has done a really bad job of doing that. So how did we get there? How did we get to the point? And this is, y'all, I want to focus in on this for the majority of our time because we have to set the framework. But this, to me, is the most interesting piece for the whole of what we're going to do tonight. How did we get to this space? How did we find ourselves in the moment where we as the church, we as individuals, are willing to shift our moral framework so quickly and so easily so that we might have a victory, so that we might have success? And here's what Russell lays out. Wendell Berry, if you're not familiar with Wendell, great writer, he says that one of the most destructive ideas in our culture in this moment is that extraordinary times justify extraordinary measures. This is the ultimate relativism, and we are hearing it now from all sides of the spectrum. The most destructive idea, extraordinary times justify extraordinary measures. Have you not heard that this is the most important election in the whole of human history? Have you not heard that? But let me remind you, I heard it in 2020, and I heard it in 2016, and I heard it in 2012. I don't remember if I heard it in 2008. Y'all, don't you yearn for the day? I will never forget this. Going back to the first election that I was really paying attention in, McCain-Obama. And there's this public debate between the two of them, and I hope y'all remember this. And a lady stands up, and she's talking to John McCain. Oh, no, Obama wasn't even there. It was just McCain doing a town hall. And this lady stands up, and she goes, he was born in a foreign country, and he doesn't love America. And she goes on and on and on. Can you imagine a scenario like this happening today? On either side of the political opinion, and not just for president, but for any down ticket thing, where McCain, he stops and he said, ma'am, I need you to stop, because I know Barack Obama, and I disagree with him on a number of things, but I also know he loves America. Your moral framework matters. My God, don't you yearn for those days again? Every single thing is the biggest and most important thing. And we find ourselves living in a perpetual time of crisis. And so, guys, you need to set your morals aside, because if we don't win this one, then the country's going to go downhill and we're never going to recover. We don't need to talk about this particular ministry item in this moment, because the culture is charged. We don't need to talk about justice, biblical justice. Amos says, let justice roll down like waters. But y'all, we can't talk about justice right now because it might offend some people. Because this is an extraordinary time. You all know what I'm talking about, don't you? But here's what Russell says, and I want to remind you that this is true. We compromise our character because of emergencies, but the emergencies never end. The emergencies never end, do they? And we find ourselves at some point feeling the shift inside of our own hearts. And we don't talk about the things that matter. And sometimes we compromise what we know to be true because we believe that this is an emergency, and extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures. That, to me, is one of the most important things. This is really great, and I actually think this is where I found the chapter most interesting. If you're reading the book, this is where I found the chapter most compelling, because he says, how do we get here? We compromise our character because of extraordinary moments, right? Extraordinary measures, extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures. And he goes, if you want to know how this extends beyond politics, look at the Southern Baptist Convention. Look at the Southern Baptist Convention. And this quote, I love this part. He says, when questioned, did I not put that in here? Oh, I guess I didn't, or maybe my kids moved it. But y'all, he tells a story. He tells a story about the Southern Baptist Convention and how the Southern Baptist Convention in the when did the war happen? Do you guys remember this? The conservative, or was it the 80s, Bill? I believe, yeah, late 80s. So there was a division within the Southern Baptist Convention. And this is fascinating. I didn't grow up in it. I'm still not deeply connected to it one way or the other. But what is fascinating to me is I've got friends who are very conservative theologically, and I have friends who are very progressive theologically. And depending on where you are on that spectrum, the language you use, you either call it the fundamentalist takeover or the conservative resurgence. Isn't it funny how language matters in moments like these, you guys? And he talks about how what happens, and Russell at this point is fully invested in the conservative resurgence of the Southern Baptist Convention. And he says this is the sort of rhetoric we heard, that these are extraordinary times and they call for extraordinary measures. And he says, and you guys, please go, if you have not read this chapter and you've got the book, read it. Because he talks about two men in particular. He doesn't name them, but I'm happy to. Paul Pressler and Paige Patterson, who were the architects of the conservative resurgence. And at the end of the day, the conservative movement in the Southern Baptist Convention, it prevailed, and theological orthodoxy won the day. And guys, for me, I actually think, hey, good, right? There was some liberal movement in the Southern Baptist Convention that probably wasn't healthy. And so there was a division. And these two architects of the Southern Baptist, of the conservative resurgence, Paul Pressler and Paige Patterson, you guys, everybody knew these weren't good people. Everybody knew these were actually really bad men. Paige Patterson was known, at this point, he's the president of a seminary, a Southern Baptist seminary. And he was well known for sending you a bouquet of flowers if you had done something to cross him. And if he sent you a bouquet of flowers, do you know what that meant? Your career was over because you were dead to him. Paul Pressler was a judge, and they envisioned and were architects for how we would win. And we did. But y'all, at the end of the day, everybody knew they were slimy, and everyone let them take positions of power. And in wake of 2016 in the Me Too movement, Paul Pressler, a judge, comes out that he is a child molester and was molesting children, and people knew it, even back then. And Paige Patterson was well aware that women were being sexually abused and harassed, and told women who came to him and said they wanted to make a public claim, he told them that if they did that, he would shame them publicly and disavow them. But extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures. And when we forsake our morality for the cause, whatever the cause might be, don't forget that ultimately it does something to your souls. What is most damaging for me in this whole chapter that we read, all the way going back to morality, remember, he says we've reached the point that for many self-professed Christians, we are now at the moment where a lack of Christian character is actually seen as a benefit. It's actually seen as a benefit. Well, I don't want a pastor to be the president. I want somebody who's going to get things done. You've heard that, right? I've heard it. And you guys, man, look at Liberty University. You guys familiar with Liberty? Jerry Falwell founded Liberty University, and when Jerry died, his son, Jerry Falwell Jr., took over. And all the while he is the president or the chancellor of the largest Christian university in the United States, maybe even the world, the rhetoric he used consistently and over again was, I'm a businessman. I'm not a pastor like my dad. I'm a businessman. And people celebrated it. And then guess what happened to him? He got caught in a ridiculous scandal that I would feel guilty even mentioning in this sacred space. And all the while he said, I'm not a pastor. I'm a businessman. And people celebrated it. We are at a moment now for so many Christians embodying the virtues and values of forgiveness and grace and generosity are seen as a liability. When's the last time you heard a politician of any stripe say the words, I was wrong? Think about it. When's the last time you heard a politician, whether local government, the mayor, all the way up to the president of the United States, say the words, I'm sorry? Part of what it means to be a Christian is to believe, and I love this section. Russell talks about total depravity. I don't know that I'm all on board with that whole concept, but I actually think he's right in this respect, that sin taints every single area of our lives. Our hearts, our minds, our actions, all of it. For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And one of the benchmark beliefs of Christianity is that we are all in need of forgiveness. We are all in need of repentance, which is to say, every once in a while, we have to be willing to say, I was wrong. I'm sorry. I didn't do the right thing. But now, you guys, in our public square, we have made saying things like that a liability rather than a virtue, a sign of weakness rather than a sign and signal of strength. And when we do that, what I'm telling you is ultimately we are going to be losing our souls. This is really important because you've all heard it, right? But what about? But what about the other side? Yeah, I know my person's not great, but what about what they said? Who has said that? Be honest, who has said that? I will be transparent and tell you I've said it. In my thinking about politics, in my thinking about church, in my thinking about whatever, right? I can look at some crooked guy and go, yeah, they're bad, but this person's worse. Because it's always easy to point out what's worse about other people, right? Russell says, when we get to that point, which do some deep soul work, you guys, when questions of morality become, what about the other side? It doesn't matter where one person stands on the religious or political spectrum. One has embraced moral relativism. If I could put it another way, Jesus says you are to build your house on rock. When you start saying, but what about the other side? You're building your house on sand. And it is so easy to be swept away by the winds of culture and by the winds of whatever is coming our way, and we compromise our morals because what about them? It's not an easy thing to wrestle with, but I think it's really important for us to understand. When conscience, okay, this is good. When conscience means nothing, the only thing that is left is power. When conscience means nothing, the only thing that is left is power. And that is a dangerous place to be. Where's our moral framework? Our institutions are part of what's gotten us to the place where we are. Russell talks about how our institutions now are at the place where our institutions seem to be defining character by success rather than the other way around. So what's the ultimate goal? It's to win. What's the ultimate goal? Let's talk about, all right, so now, y'all, I'm going to go meta for a minute. Let's transcend politics for a minute. Let's talk about university. Let's talk about college. What's the goal of college? If you're a university president right now, do you know what the goal of college is? It is not to educate kids. Don't believe that for a second. It's to win. Is to have success by getting as many kids enrolled as you possibly can, to increase the endowment, to increase the income, to increase the revenue. And we are defining success, we are defining character by success rather than defining character as the ultimate measure of success. And this is really important. Our institutions are meant to be led by people of well-formed character. And character is meant to be formed in institutions. But where we find ourselves in the current moment is that our institutions don't have the proper moral character, and they're not being led by people who have proper moral character. And so we are in this endless cycle of chaos, aren't we? What do we do about it? Oh my goodness, you guys. What do we do? And you might not be able to read this because it's pretty small. But here's what Russell says, and this to me is where I think we really ought to spend most of our attention. The first thing you can do is you prioritize long-term integrity over short-term success. You prioritize long-term integrity over short-term success. Jesus says, what profits a man if he gains the whole world, but he loses his soul? If you win one election, but you sell your soul in order to do it. Extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures. And at the end of the day, do you know what you've done? You've lost. Because not only have you compromised the witness of the gospel for future generations, but if I can remind you, part of what you are doing is you are shifting something inside of your own heart. Remember what the long-term goal is. Pay attention to the means and not just the ends. You can do the right thing, but if you do it the wrong way, you're still wrong, aren't you? How we go about doing things ultimately matters. The measure of what success is isn't victory. The measure of success is faithfulness. And if in order to win, you have to compromise your moral integrity or your faithful following of Jesus, then you ought to take a look in the mirror. The third thing, this is really important for me, expect better of your institutions. Expect better out of your institutions, especially the church. My wife loves the public school that our kids go to. And she came home one day and she was frustrated about some things, and she said, "What do I do? What do I do to make a difference?" And I said, "You know what you do." She said, "Call the principal?" And I said, "No, you run for school board." And she said, "Are you serious?" And I said, "I'm dead serious. You're the pastor's wife. You'll win in a landslide." Expect better from your institutions. Y'all, we've gotten to the place where it is routine and regular to say the words, "I'm choosing the lesser of two evils." We've gotten to the place where we don't have any expectation that the people that are running for public office are virtuous, Christ-following, genuinely good people. Ultimately, we have found ourselves in a place where we believe, I think, that most people are just out for their own. And they're out for power. And they're out for success. And they're out for themselves. It doesn't have to be that way. It shouldn't be that way. People of good character need to expect better from our institutions. And let me speak specifically to the church. It breaks my heart every single time I see a pastor who has a scandal and who falls. And I think we ought to offer grace and we ought to offer forgiveness. But you guys, the church, as I talked about on Sunday, we use language, right, all the time of the church is not a resort for the holy, but it's a hospital for the sinners. And that's true. It is absolutely true. But the whole series that I'm going to be preaching about in Ephesians is remember, you are in Christ, and what is true of him is true of you. And what I'm talking about on Sunday, the same Spirit of God that raised Jesus from the dead is the same Spirit that is at work in me and in you. And we are called to be transformed into the image of Jesus. And as leaders in the church, we are called to live in that manner. Let me be clear. If I were to have an affair, I'm not qualified to be the pastor of a church anymore. I know that sounds harsh, but it's true. And we have come to expect so little of our leaders. And we're so quick to say, well, they're just human. That's true. But the faithful witness of the church, I signed up for this thing knowing that the standard is high. I signed up for this thing, love your wife as Jesus loves the church and was willing to die for her. And in the impetus, maybe to be graceful, but also maybe to cover up for the shortcomings of the people we want to be in power because they help us be successful, we end up costing a whole lot more, which is the faithful witness of the gospel. Expect better from your institutions, you guys. Expect better from your institutions. I want to be careful. The church where I was at before I came here, it's deacon election time. It's deacon election time. And we talk about nominating deacons, and deacons come in, and I'll never forget this. I'm looking over the nomination slate with the pastor, and we're going through, and one gentleman comes up, and he's been nominated to be a deacon. But can I tell you something? He's a scoundrel. He's not a good man by any stretch. And I said, Pastor, this gentleman here is of ill repute by all people. Maybe I didn't say it that way, but it was something like that. And he looked at me and he said, but he's a great Sunday school teacher, and he gives a lot of money to the church. And he's going to be on the ballot. You guys, when we compromise our morals to maintain power, when we compromise our morals to not offend people, we're ultimately doing way more damage than we are doing good. Expect better from your institutions, especially the church. And the final thing is protect your conscience. Protect your conscience. It is very easy in the culture in which we are living because everyone is so angry. Everybody's angry. And if you watched the debate last night, I did not watch it, but I did read. I read the Wall Street Journal and I read the New York Times. So this morning I got an equal outlook on how things went. And let me tell you what, one side said one person did well, the other side said the other person did well. But everybody was pretty well agreed on. Everybody was mad. Everybody's mad. Protect your conscience because it is so easy for you to get mad. It's so easy for you to begin defining people by language that is dehumanizing. They're the enemy. They're wicked. They're evil. Protect your conscience. Because if we take the gospel seriously, we will never speak that way of other human beings. We can disagree with them. We can vehemently disagree with them. We can hold principled positions, but we will never demonize another human being because we are at war, not with other people, but as Paul says in Ephesians 6, with the powers and the principalities. I'm going to preach on that in a few weeks. But for today, what can you do? We're living in an age of moral relativism. Root yourself in the gospel. Prioritize long-term integrity over short-term success. Pay attention to the means and not the ends. Expect better from your institutions, especially the church. Protect your conscience. And the final thing I would say, and this is really important for me, right? Because going back to that section where Russell talks about everything is the most important thing. Extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures. And if we don't get this one right, everything's going to crumble. Leslie Newbigin, the great South African missiologist, somebody asked him once, they said, are you a pessimist or an optimist about the future? And I love what he said. If you've heard me say it before. He said, I'm neither a pessimist nor an optimist. Jesus Christ is risen from the dead. We ultimately know how the story ends. Nothing is the most important thing because the most important thing has already happened. He walked out of the tomb on Easter, and he'll come again in glory to make all things right. And if we know that, it gives us a little better framework, doesn't it? And so, it is 6:46. I will pause and see, do we have any questions? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sin practiced long enough becomes no sin. Okay, listen. There was one line at the end of the chapter that I think was great, and I meant to put it on there, but I didn't. Sin has to do not only with what you are doing, but what sort of person you are becoming. And the danger in compromising our morality is that slowly things that we know are wrong become normalized. Sin is not just what you are doing in the current moment, but ultimately it's about the sort of person that you are becoming for the future. Hell has oftentimes been defined as total separation from God. And Sam Wells, a British theologian, talks about how we can find ourselves, even in the current moment, through decisions we make and ways we choose to live, getting further and further away from the image of God, which is ultimately isolation and abandonment from God. And we find ourselves living in hell right now. And it isn't just when we die, But through the decisions we make in the current moment, we become isolated and estranged from God through our own decisions. Sin is not just something you're doing in the current moment, but it's about the sort of person you're becoming for the future. Really important. Yes, Charles. Yeah. So what Charles says is when we talk about moral relativism and the lesser of two evils, it's the same side. How did you frame that? Yeah, different side of the same coin. Yeah. I thought it was, there's one section in the book where Russell talks about projectioning. The scapegoat mechanism, as Rene Girard calls it. And he says basically what we do is we take the thing we hate most about ourselves and we project that onto other people. And so, for example, and this is true because I've experienced in my own life, some of the people that are the most stringent and strident defenders of orthodoxy, of Christian orthodoxy, are the people who have no prayer life and don't actually believe anything at all. They project what they hate about themselves onto other people. Some of the folks Russell talks about who are the most, I want to make sure I get this language right here. Some of the most ferocious, man, I can't even read my own handwriting. Some of the most ferocious defenders of denouncers, some of the most ferocious denouncers of sexual immorality in the culture are actually nihilists in their own personal sexual lives. How often have you heard a pastor who preached lots of sermons about sexual morality only to find that they're engaged in some of the most terrible behaviors you could imagine? The scapegoat mechanism. We take what we hate about ourselves and we project it on other people. Yeah, two sides of the same coin. Yeah, for sure. What else? Yes, Christy. Mm-hmm. Ice cream is ruined. Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. Wrong, yes. I will even go further than that, Christy, and say even beyond the division of our political parties, right? I can't remember who said it, but they said we are Americans best, as Christians, we are Americans best when we are not Americans first, right? The Christian faith we hold is not a national thing, but it is a global movement. And if I take my faith seriously, y'all listen to this, and I mean it. If I take my faith seriously, I have more in common with an Iranian Christian than I do with a Muslim American. Because our most deeply held beliefs are not my nation. They're not my political party, but they're the crucified and resurrected Christ. In the last chapter, Russell says, if you want to talk about the value that we hold in our faith, would you rather live on a street that is filled with atheists and they only put up Christmas decorations because it's cultural expectation, or would you rather live on a street that is filled with Indonesian Christians and you're the only white person? It says a lot about what we think about what ultimately matters. I think it is, yes, absolutely. I go even further, right? I go even further. And I do love that. When you mix church and state, it is the mixture of ice cream and manure, and the manure stays fine, but the ice cream gets ruined. The church does have a voice. The church ought to say what we believe, but when we capitulate, when we equate the gospel with one political party or another, that's what you're getting at, and that's where the difficulty comes in. You guys, ultimately, and I want to remind us again and again and again, Russell is writing from a particular viewpoint because of his experience with the evangelical church that has so aligned itself with the conservative right movement. But this is not about that. This book is ultimately a reminder for everybody that the moral framework that we find ourselves rooted in through the gospel is bigger than any political party. Long-term integrity over short-term success. That, to me, is, I think, the biggest takeaway. So, 654, if it's burning on your heart and you got to say it, do it. But otherwise, I'm going to land the plane. Yes? Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I placed you there on purpose tonight to ask that question. I'm kidding. Y'all, so her question was, is there not a list of qualifications in the Bible for how we ought to think about our leaders? Yeah, Paul writes his letter to Timothy, and then there's some qualifications in others of Paul's letters. And then, I think just as importantly, there's the fruit of the Spirit that Paul talks about in his letter to the church at Galatia. These ought to be the measures that we use. If anybody tells you that isn't how we should choose our Christian leaders, I'm telling you this, and I want to speak it with as much authority as I can, they're not telling you the truth. Yeah. So my general advice to you and to everyone on this room is over the course, how many days is it until Election Day? Whatever, however many days, and then add an extra 60 on top of it. I mean it. Limit your social media exposure. I deleted Facebook from my phone. I deleted Instagram from my phone. I've never felt better. Never felt better. I check it once a week on my laptop. I only spend about 5 minutes. I've missed a couple of important things that people have sent me, but I responded and said, I'm so sorry. My soul feels better. Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. Go and read those pastoral qualifications, 1st, 2nd Timothy, Titus, and then some of Paul's letters to the church at Galatia as well. Go read that because you will be glad that you did. And you'll be convicted about what it looks like to lead in the church. So, you guys, I'm thankful for you, grateful for you. Hope you come back next week. We're going to continue on in our conversation.